interests me are not just the sordid little stories of Hollywood. Somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Good evening, everyone. It is nice to see some new faces among you. It really means a lot to have all of you here. My name is Dan Watkins, and I'd like to first start by welcoming you all to Between the Dial, a project where we attempt to plot a long, strange roadmap through the dark heart of Los Angeles, in the hopes of uncovering a hidden geography that sits right atop our own. I hope that whatever friends steered you in my direction have let you know what you're in for. Nothing crazy, mind you. More a lot of dry descriptions of streets and buildings, and that is where we will start today. Here in romantic, luxurious Burbank, California. I'm kidding, of course, but I do really love Burbank. There's a year-round Halloween store and a place to purchase and process Super 8mm film on the same block. And yet it still seems to end up the butt of so many jokes. Anyway, I'm not just standing in Burbank. I'm standing at 3700 Barham Boulevard, the address of one of the most depressing apartment complexes in Los Angeles. That's right, you guessed it, I'm at the Oakwood Apartments. It's not overtly depressing here, whatever that means. There's plenty of sunshine, there's a pool. What makes it so depressing is hard to pin down, but I think it has something to do with all of its blandness. And the fact that the units come pre-furnished, and the biggest reason without question can be found every late January through April, which, as many of you know, is a time known round the city as pilot season. Terrifying, I know. And every pilot season, scores and scores of parents descend on the Oakwood with their children, plucked from their schools and their routines in the hopes that their child has the look, the chops, and the luck to land themselves a role on the next big sitcom, or serialized drama, or commercial. Hell, almost anything except an unpaid UCLA student film. Needless to say, it's a lot of pressure to put on a child, and a lot of parents put themselves at a great deal of financial risk to realize this dream. Though I'm not really positive whose dream it is. The result of this yearly influx gives the place the vibe of a summer camp, but one where every child wants to command the attention of the entire room. Basically, it's like theater camp. During pilot season, the Oakwood hosts industry mixers where talent scouts and agents mingle with the parents and the small would-be stars. They have karaoke nights, and they also have a big Oscar party. Then, when April rolls around, those who were lucky enough to book something get to stay. They move into real apartments and send for the rest of the family and make a go of stardom. But for the vast majority who leave with nothing new on their young resumes, they pack up and leave the Oakwood for home. They go back to their schools, and their parents must decide whether they want to make a go of it again next year. Either way, by late spring, the Oakwood quiets down considerably. What remains are the older tenants, who are typically on a predictably more downward trajectory. Some are older Hollywood types who never really made it. Some are former stars who weren't able to keep the fame train going. And a great some are recent divorcees who are using the Oakwood as a way to rebuild the lives they lost. Most, however, are somewhere in between the three. Just people looking to live a comfortable life and happy with not having to think about things like how to decorate an apartment. These people are the ones who stay long after the party has ended. Maybe that's what makes the place so depressing. The place feels like a summer camp in the fall. Maybe I'm being too harsh. I just wanted to talk about the Oakwood because it attracts so many wannabe child stars. And the story I want to tell you today is a very, very tragic story about one girl who actually did make it all the way to the top. So because this is a tragic story about a child, I feel I should give you a warning that this will likely be the most difficult subject matter that we have dealt with thus far. So there. You are warned. Today we will be talking about the terribly short life of Heather O'Rourke. And as strange as it sounds, hers is a story that people have used from time to time to push various agendas, conspiracy theories, and other such libelous accusations. What I want to do in telling her story is parse through all of the rhetoric to try to get at what the likely truth behind all of it is. I know I'm being vague, but I promise I will explain all of it by the end. But first, we should learn how it all started. Heather was born December 27, 1975, in sunny San Diego, to two working-class parents named Michael and Kathleen. She also had an older sister named Tammy, who was, by all accounts, the actor in the family. Michael and Kathleen's marriage was not a happy one, and the two of them divorced in 1981. Right about the time that Tammy landed a role in Herbert Ross's Pennies from Heaven, starring Steve Martin and Bernadette Peters. So Kathleen packed up the kids, who were at this time living with her new husband in a trailer park in Anaheim, and headed for MGM. At the same time, Steven Spielberg was 6 films into a storied career. And at this point, in 1981, he was red hot. He had made Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the first Indiana Jones movie, and was in the process of prepping 2 new projects. E.T., the Extraterrestrial, which he would direct himself, and Poltergeist, which was to be directed by Tobe Hooper, who was a horror icon in his own right, having directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Both of these films needed a young girl to perform in a principal role, and Spielberg was on the lookout. And so, as the story goes, the O'Rourke family was having lunch in the MGM commissary while Tammy was on a break from filming, when Steven Spielberg spotted Heather. Supposedly, he offered her the role of Carol Ann Freeling in Poltergeist right there on the spot. She was 5 years old. Drew Barrymore, who was originally cast in the role, would instead be bumped to E.T. Assuming you've seen Poltergeist, I don't need to tell you that Heather O'Rourke absolutely killed it. She was a natural. That said, stories about the filming of Poltergeist have become the stuff of urban legend. For instance, at one point, JoBeth Williams, who plays Heather's mother in the film, is supposed to slip and fall into a mucky pit that the family was in the process of turning into a swimming pool. When she lands, she is then beset by skeletons. It's an iconic scene, but it has long been rumored that many of the skeletons down there with JoBeth were actually real human remains. What's worse, or better depending on your perspective, is that these rumors have since been more or less confirmed by the props department who worked on the film. All contemporary reports from the set contend that Heather was treated quite well by the filmmakers. She was removed from scenes that she found to be too frightening and replaced with a stunt performer, and even got to ride bikes with Steven Spielberg during breaks in filming. All in all, it seems like a pretty standard big-budget film set. And when it was finally released in 1982, it was greeted warmly by critics and audiences, becoming the highest-grossing horror film of the year, and has since gone down as an unmitigated classic of the genre. But unfortunately, before we make it to present day, there will be a few real-life horrors attached to this film that tip its scales further towards infamy. The first tragedy associated with Poltergeist occurred when Dominic Dunne, who plays the Freeling's oldest child, was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, just a few months after the film was released. His sentence was pled to voluntary manslaughter, which is an affront to the victims by all standards. Or, again, I suppose I should say, in my opinion, it is an affront to the victims by all standards, but come on. The Poltergeist films have a bit of a reputation as a cursed franchise, and I'm not really interested in going into all the details as to why. Outside of Dominic Dunne, there were two other cast members whose deaths were less unexpected. Julian Beck had stomach cancer, and Will Sampson died after a heart transplant. But now it's time to talk about Heather O'Rourke. After her debut, Heather O'Rourke secured herself a great many television roles on hit shows like Chips, Webster, and Happy Days. With her newfound success, her mother was able to move the family out of the trailer park and into a house on Big Bear Lake. And that money train kept rolling because, like all horror films that experience even modest success, Poltergeist would get the sequel treatment in 1986. Neither Tobe Hooper or Steven Spielberg returned for this film, and instead, directorial duties fell to a British director named Brian Gibson. All of the original cast returned, minus, of course, Dominic Dunne. Production of the sequel was far more chill, shall we say. No human skeletons, no muck or goo, and it was far less physically demanding on the performers. Poltergeist 2 was also not as well received, but that wouldn't stop MGM from greenlighting a third film to begin production in 1987 for a 1988 release. But unfortunately, Heather O'Rourke wouldn't live to see its release, as she would die suddenly on February 1st, 1988. She was 12 years old. The cause of her death should be easy enough to describe here, but it has quite unfortunately become a fulcrum of dispute, rumor, and accusation. To tell the official story, we need to back up 1 year to 1987, when Heather became severely ill with Giardia, which she contracted from the well water used at her family home in Big Bear. When she was taken to the doctor, they also diagnosed her with Crohn's disease, for which she was treated with cortisone injections. She would receive these injections throughout the course of filming Poltergeist 3. Then on January 31st, Heather O'Rourke began complaining of flu-like symptoms and stomach cramps. The following morning, she collapsed in her home and was rushed to the hospital. While en route, she went into cardiac arrest, but paramedics were able to restart her heart at 9:25 a.m. She was then flown by helicopter to the Children's Hospital of San Diego, where it was discovered that her Crohn's diagnosis in 1987 was inaccurate. It was instead discovered that she suffered from a congenital condition called stenosis of the intestine, which resulted in a narrowing of her digestive tract. This was causing an intestinal blockage, and upon discovery, Heather O'Rourke was prepped for emergency surgery. The surgery went as good as could be expected, but Heather once again went into cardiac arrest while lying in the recovery room. The doctors performed CPR for over 30 minutes in an attempt to revive her, but this would ultimately prove unsuccessful. She would be pronounced dead at 2:45 p.m., with the cause listed as acute intestinal stenosis complicated by septic shock, meaning that the stenosis caused a rupture in her digestive tract, resulting in a blood infection. A sadly painful way to go. A suit was filed by her mother against the doctors who had initially misdiagnosed Heather, and that suit was settled out of court. That is the official story of record, and it is a sad, sad story. But it's not the only story that has been put forth to explain the death of Heather O'Rourke, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't touch on those stories that have sprouted up in recent years, as well as how their prevalence today relates to the cultural zeitgeist of the moment. I will attempt to look at all of this objectively, but to be completely frank, a lot of this will sound familiar to anyone well-versed in the rhetoric of moral panics. But here we go. For years, it has been speculated that Heather O'Rourke was the victim of sexual abuse, suffered at the hands of the powerful Hollywood players by whom she was employed. Furthermore, rumors claim that her death was actually caused by the extreme severity of that abuse. I have tried to trace the source of these claims, but doing so just leaves me traveling in increasingly disturbing circles. And when no proof materializes, everyone just falls back on that perennial refrain: you need to read read between the lines. If untrue, and spoiler, I have uncovered no proof and thus have no reason to believe the abuse story is true, then it's a truly despicable fiction to put into the world. But again, I kept digging to try to get to the source of the story. The most comprehensive text I have found to lay claim to the legitimacy of the abuse resulting in death theory is the dog-whistly titled website vigilanttcitizen.com. The article on that site traces these claims back to a since-removed blind item from the website Crazy Days and Nights in 2017. The same year that QAnon began posting, by the way. No relation, I'm sure. The blind item laid out a story of systemic abuse of the young cast of a show called Rocky Road at the hands of the, quote, elites that ran the studio. Heather O'Rourke was a guest star on that show, and the claim was that it was backstage, behind the Jeopardy set, that her deadly abuse took place. The site goes on to claim that once interred, Heather's gravesite was vandalized, with someone having spray painted the words "all worn out" in red across the front. Allegedly, the cops were called and photos were taken, but according to the story, the pictures didn't develop properly, and the grave was cleaned before they could be retaken. The story goes on to detail 2 clandestine exhumations and mysterious after-dark mourners who unfortunately could never be apprehended. The citation for the vandalism story is also a post from a blind item on the site Crazy Days and Nights in 2020. VigilantCitizen.com is a site full of this stuff, but is dedicated mainly to finding satanic messages in pop culture, to create the illusion that Christianity and, quote, Christian values are under attack. It also trades in homophobic and anti-trans hate speech, and mainly seems to exist to stoke the anger of a right-leaning, media-illiterate section of the population, in what I can assume is some sort of grift to make money from ad clicks and Facebook shares. If you can't tell by my tone, then I will just come out and say it. VigilantCitizen.com is a textbook fake news site. Now I have to address the red shoes story. And this one is gruesome, so I do want to warn anyone who may not want to hear it. But here it goes. The story goes that in 2017, there's that year again, former child star Macaulay Culkin appeared on a French radio show, and in an interview tells a story about the satanic ritual abuse of children at the hands of unnamed Hollywood executives. He claims that one executive brought Culkin into his office and gestured to his bright red shoes. Then, in an attempt to terrify Culkin into compliance, told him that those red shoes were made from the skin of Heather O'Rourke. This story made the rounds on the Facebook timelines of your most gullible relatives for a while, but it was, in short time, proven to be completely false. The story was carried on similar fake news sites like Vigilant Citizen, sites like News Punch and Your News Wire. And before you say, wait, how dare you impugn the good people of newspunch.com, because that Macaulay Culkin story was cited from an article in the respectable French newspaper Los Echos. And I would have to admit, you are right, it was. But that citation was unfortunately also a fabrication. These rumors and blind items and news punch stories all use the language of moral panic, specifically that of the Satanic Panic and its 21st century cousin QAnon. The fact that these stories began to surface in 2017 at the birth of the QAnon movement is no coincidence. If you can recall, one of their favorite targets along with Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks was Steven Spielberg. So it's an easy connection to make that they would try to weaponize the tragic death of a young girl he worked with in order to strengthen their tapestry about satanic elites abusing and sacrificing children in order to harvest their Orgone energy. But Heather's story is not that story. That is not to say that child abuse isn't real. It most definitely is. But I think we shouldn't soon forget the lessons we learned during the Satanic Panic. Statistically, most child abuse occurs within the home. So it's just as important to look inward as outward. It's also not to say that conspiracies don't exist. They most certainly do. I am open to anyone who feels like they can shed more light on Heather's story. But all I have found thus far are fear-mongering bloggers using her to generate clicks. No more than that. But here at the Oakwood, I may be pushing the limits of my visitor parking pass. So we should probably get going before too long. Just a few weeks from now, we will begin to see the first wave of new auditioners and their parents converging on this very parking lot. There is a palpable energy to it. It's the energy of potential. And while many head to the Oakwood as a first step on a limitless upward trajectory to the stars, there are just as many who come here to the Oakwood on the downward end of that slope. In 2010, the full dichotomy of the Oakwood could be witnessed in the death of a man who was, ironically for a time, one of the fastest rising child stars of the 1980s. But at the time of his death at the Oakwood Apartments, he was broke, waist deep in an addiction to pharmaceuticals, and living with his mother. That man was Lost Boys star Corey Haim, who died on March 10th, right in the middle of pilot season, at 38 years old.
Corey Haim has died from an apparent overdose.
He joins the ranks of the many ghosts who are said to haunt the Oakwood. Rick James being another, who died at the Oakwood in August 2004, at the age of 58. I've been strolling around the Oakwood now for a while, and I haven't seen anything. The place is pretty still. It's a little too cold now for people to use the pool or grill outdoors. And it kind of feels like I've had the whole place to myself. Unfortunately, it is not a place I wish to keep. So let's part ways for now. Usually I would say let's meet next week, but truthfully, we won't be doing that. I'm not sure when we will see each other again, but I'm sure that we will. One day. But even though I won't be with you, I'd still love it if you would drive safely. Between the Dial was written and produced by me, Daniel Watkins. If you want to check out all of the other stuff I do, then head over to landturtlerecords.com. That's landturtlerecords.com. If you, for instance, have enjoyed the music you've been listening to, you can find it there. And if you want to follow me on social media, I am at Epcot Fitzgerald on Instagram. That is Epcot_Fitzgerald on Instagram. Good night, y'all.